Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about, as Joe had indicated, he was kind of giving the big picture overview, and each one of us are going in and kind of breaking each piece down in a little bit more depth. And the area that I'm focusing on is disaster planning. And just so you all know, if there's any concerns, I'm not going to go into labor, hopefully. I'm only 7 months, so it's not like I'm going to go tomorrow, to assure all of you. But when we talk about disaster planning, as Joe had indicated, earlier on, the focus was really on IT disaster recovery, and business continuity has been broadened over time, and it's really now focused on 3 specific categories, which is the business and systems, and then that workforce continuity piece, which is what we were talking about, the people side of things. And really, that people side didn't get much attention paid to it until we had some of those large-scale events, like the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, or September 11th, or Hurricane Katrina, or the pandemic scare. That's really what drew businesses into looking at that aspect of it. And that's what we're going to focus on, obviously, is the workforce side of things, and what are the challenges that you might be faced with in relation to a disaster, and what are some tips to help you and start preparing for that. The other thing I like to put out there too, which is also kind of what Joe said, is, we get into this mentality that it's not going to happen to me, or it's not going to happen to my organization. And we're in Wisconsin, right? So we're like, well, hey, we're not by oceans, so we don't have to worry about hurricanes, or, our cities aren't big enough, terrorists don't want to attack us, or even tornadoes. Yes, we have tornadoes, but they're not like they are in the South. However, we've had our fair share. We've had our tornadoes. We had Union Grove. We had the Eagle tornado and the Stoughton tornado that did severe damage. And also there were some injuries and fatalities. We've had floods. And actually, we had, if you heard from last night, Manitowoc County just had some flooding up there as well. In July of 2010, we had the Wisconsin determined a state of emergency because we had so much flooding going on. There were 28,000 homes that were damaged. Then we had those 2 stints right in June of 2008 with Lake Dalton as well as Pewaukee Lake, and there was a lot of flooding and roads were closed. So we're not immune to this either. And the last thing is plant explosions. We've had plant explosions right around us. The New Page Paper Mill Corporation had their explosion. We had the Patrick Cutter-Hay fire, the Falk Corporation explosion. So, we don't think these things can happen, but you turn around in an instant and boom, something could occur that throws the organization off. We've obviously, our background is in crisis, and we have had a lot of experience with some of these organizations when they've been faced with them. And there's been a common theme in relation to the challenges that come out of an event once it occurs. And some of those main themes that are in place is first the accounting for employees post-evacuation. If you think about that, yes, even if you have the greatest plan in place and people have an idea about how to get out of the building, depending on what happens or what type of incident it is, can really throw things off. One company that we partnered with that had a plant explosion, it was a beautiful sunny day, production was going well, and then all of a sudden things changed in a minute and the plant exploded. It was a natural gas explosion. Well, what happens? Think of that. And it tore up half of the building. So you've got people in the building, about 250, and now they're running for their lives. I mean, it's not about, I got to think about the route that I need to get out of. It's survival mode. I need to get out of this building. And the exits that maybe were originally there may no longer be there. The lights are out because the explosion took that out. So now you can't really see and how to get out of the building. You got people injured and running around screaming. It throws you off. And you got to think about that. Are they going to go out the building? Do they know that they're going to need to go to an assembly point for you to account for them? Or are they going to potentially just get out of here and go home or get away from the building? And how do you then get back to who is where and who's missing and who might be injured? So we'll talk about that more in depth. The other piece is what has already been put out there, is addressing family members' needs for information. Again, it goes along those lines. You're not thinking, I'm going to grab my cell phone, before I get out of the building. You're out. You're not grabbing your purse. You're not grabbing your cell phone. You want to skedaddle. And so if people don't have their cell phones, and as we know with social media, that information gets out there rather quickly, well, as soon as a family member finds out that something happened at that building where you work, they're going to try to call you. They can't get a hold of you because either one, you don't have your phone, or your phone is inoperable because something happened to it. So then what are they going to do? They're going to call the facility. I want to know what's going on. Is my loved one okay? Then they call the facility. Well, the facility's lines might not be working, because if we look at that plant explosion again, now what are they going to do? They're going to call company headquarters, or they might call other locations that are associated with that company to get information. And how do you manage that? How do you keep that communication consistent and get that information out? And then just assisting employees in the aftermath. The plant might, or your business might not be able to operate right away. Or if we again look at that plant explosion, people's cars were damaged. People didn't have access to their keys. They didn't have access to their wallets. So they wanted to get into their homes. How are you going to address that? You got to think about that and plan for that ahead of time. And then as time goes by, we got to think about compensation. Are we going to continue to pay people while we're trying to rebuild or determine a backup location to reopen operations? Are we going to cover benefits? What about medical costs in relation to people who are injured? So in regards to that mindset of looking into that, we're going to kind of go over some of those lessons learned and then best practices to help you in addressing those areas. So we're going to look at what obviously has been the theme here, refining evacuation and shelter and plan places that are in place. So you want to look at it, is what I have in place make sense? And do the evacuation routes, are they appropriate? And then implementing processes to accurately account for employees. Again, we can't assume that everybody's going to get out of the building and go to the spot that they're supposed to go to. So what do you do to account for those people who maybe they were off at lunch when it happened, or stepped away for a doctor's appointment, or came in late to work, or didn't show up to work, and you're thinking they're going to be there, and now you're trying to find out where they are. And then centralizing and compiling that information. As Andrea had talked about, you want that command center. You want one location where information is coming through, as well as getting dispersed out, and how you want that to be framed. In addition, how do you respond to family members' inquiries? Obviously, there can be large amounts of calls coming in, and how do you support that? And what systems can you put in place if you don't have maybe the telephone capacity to do that? Is there other backup plans that you can put in? And then just how do you anticipate and address employees' needs? So first, we're going to talk about refining plans. And again, there's some redundancy in what we're talking about because there's a lot of consistency in the information. As we noted, obviously, the most important thing is securing senior management support in relation to evacuation planning and communicating that to employees. And again, if senior management isn't on board with it, or if they're not visible and they're not participating in it, then other people's thought about it is just going to be like, well, they don't care about it, it must not be that important. It's also important to obviously review your evacuation plans on an ongoing basis. You feel good, you got your plan done, you put it on the shelf. Well, we got to pull it off sometimes and look at it, because maybe the space has changed. Maybe it's been reconfigured. Maybe it's expanded. Maybe your facility expanded. Or maybe there's been more employees that have been added to that space. And the other thing too is we noted with WCTC, you have your markings very clear, but maybe that's something you got to look at. Is that really well noted on our floor plans? Is it well noted within our building? And then walk the evacuation routes regularly. It gets you more exposed to what are the alternate routes that are available. And then as Joe had talked about, you go in there, you never know what you might find. So if we don't look and walk those regularly, we could stumble into things that might create more problems for us once a disaster does occur. Another example, he talked about the storage in there, but there was a fire in Chicago in a high-rise building. And so people went to the right spot, to the stairwells to evacuate the building, but when they got down to the bottom to get out of the building, the door was locked. Well, we got to think about that. People got to be able to get out. Or if there's shelter and plan in place, it's to go down a couple floors and they go to try to get into the next door, and maybe there's a swipe that you have to get in, or there's a system to get into that door. We got to evaluate that and make sure that that's open so people can get in and get through. The other thing too is obviously conducting training and testing. The more you practice it, The more it becomes a part of your culture, the more people think about it. And even myself, I was talking to Joe and Andrea about this. Years ago, I was visiting one of my companies, and this was before I got really involved into disaster management. And I was on the 3rd floor of a hotel, and the fire alarm went off. So what did I do? Of course, I needed to get out of my hotel room and get out of the building. I got out of the hotel room, I ran over to the elevator, and I hit the button as the fire alarm's going off, and I'm waiting for the elevator to come, and all of a sudden it was like, what am I doing? I can't be standing in an elevator. But that's the way I came in, and that's what I had in my head, and that's what I was accustomed to. And so you have to get people to think outside of that, and the more you expose them to it and practicing getting out in different ways, the better it is, and the more it becomes ingrained in their head. And so it's not even just they're doing it at the business, they start to think about it more when they're in other places. So maybe you're visiting a stadium or you're going to the circus. You might start to look about the routes that are ahead of you and think, okay, wait, everybody's gonna go the same way they came in. Well, if I'm at the bottom here and I try to go that way, I'm not getting out. So let's look for some alternate routes. And then obviously it's important to create an ownership and maintenance plan. You can't have several people be responsible for the plan because then it's not going to get done. It's not going to get reviewed. The testing isn't going to get completed. You want one sole ownership to make sure that that is happening. And then along those lines is just accounting for employees. And we look at that. Sometimes when you set up your zones in regards to accounting for people, you set it up by departments. But that may not necessarily be the most appropriate thing to set up because people may be in a certain department, be dispersed throughout the building. So that'd be much harder to account for those people or for those people to go out the same way and assemble at the same spot. So it's better to divide it in zones. And you don't want to go over 20 in relation to how many people they're being accounted for. The other thing too is to assign zone leaders and actually zone searchers as well. So you kind of have two roles when an evacuation occurs. The zone leader is the person who carries a list in their pocket of the people that they account for within their zone. They get out of the building, they go to their assembly point, and when everybody starts to show up, they're checking off to see if they're there and if there's anybody that's missing. Then you have the zone searcher, who is the last one to leave the building, and they're the one that goes through that zone to check to make sure that there's nobody else there before they get out. The other thing too is it's very important to ensure that plans are in place for disabled employees. We have to, sometimes we don't think about that. Obviously it's people who are physically challenged or are hearing impaired or visually impaired, but what about the people who you don't necessarily visibly see? People who might have knee injuries, have problems navigating the stairs. So that's something that you need to be paying attention to and trying to get that communication about so you know who that is, so that a buddy system can be put in place to help them get out of the building. Other important thing is to pre-identify your assembly points for every zone. And you have to be careful about where your assembly points are. What we've found sometimes is that you've got clearly defined assembly points, but they're all in one spot. So can you imagine if you got 1,000 employees all showing up in one spot, how it's going to be hard for that person who's trying to account for their people on their list? They're going to be all mixed in together. Or maybe you have good zones that are spread apart, but other businesses around you are using those same zone or those same assembly points. So now all of a sudden they're evacuating as well, and you've got all these people mixed up. So it's good not only to make sure you have your zone spaced out, but to communicate with the businesses around you to make sure that they're not using that same spot that you are. And then the other thing too is to have a check-in system in place for employees not in sight at the time of the incident. So, something that's obviously predetermined and that's put out there to employees ahead of time. Maybe there's a phone number that they call in. Maybe there's something that they text in. So if they are away at the time that the event happens, you have an ability to account for them and know that they're okay. And then have accurate floor plans available for first responders. First responders are going into an unfamiliar building. They don't know much about it, and obviously, again, it's dark, it's smoky, so it's hard for them to navigate it. If you give them those floor plans ahead of time, that's helpful for them because then they have some additional information when they go into that building to know where to go, as well as that gives them information that once you determine who are those people that are missing, that guides them into where to go to hopefully prevent somebody from being injured. This is just an example. When we talk about those first responders and compiling lists, so you've got your zone leaders that are out there pulling together who's missing. And how do you put that information together quickly? Because you want to be able to rapidly pull that together so you can get it to the first responders so they now know, okay, we've got these 5 people missing, here's where they're located, so they've got some guidance on where to find them. And we put together, this is a sample of what we put together in relation to our database to help organizations that we partner with in pulling that together rather quickly. And as you can see, it's a pretty simple process. It tells you, what the incident is, what the event is, and then each, if you see the building, it's kind of tiny. There's building 1, floor 1, zone east. So you describe each area by that. And then each of the zone leaders are reporting information in specifically to their zone. And you have a list of employees that are entered into the computer ahead of time so they can quickly run through and then mark off who's missing. So you can quickly collate that information together and provide that to first responders. And then again, this is a further sample is now you can pull together and you can run a report on who's everybody that's missing so you have that information quickly and readily available. The other important thing that we'll talk about is the centralizing and compiling of information. Again, it's very important to have a command center and having key roles within that command center that's going to be taking in information from what's going on from different areas and making decisions about what you're going to do with that. And this kind of gives you an example of if an event happens, where are some of the areas of information that you're going to be getting information from, or those areas. And it also denotes kind of what's important for you as an organization to have in place, not only within the EOC, but in other spots to make sure those connections are being made. So if we look at the smoke, so we take the plant explosion as an example, it occurs. It's very important to have a designated personnel, and obviously you want backup people as well, at each of your facilities to be the people that are the boots on the ground, per se. So they're the ones that as soon as something happens at the facility, they're right there with the incident commander and the EMTs to get information about what's going on and where people are being transported to. So that information can get fed to the EOC. It's hard to have that if you don't have a body and a presence right there where it's going on. So that's a very important thing. As well as they can give you information on accounting for people. So who's been accounting for and who's been missing. So you've got that connection right there at the site. The other important thing too, when I talk about that designated representative saying, hey, this is what I'm getting from the incident commander about, we've had 5 injuries and this is where they're going. They're not going to give you names. I mean, the EMT isn't focused on trying to find out who that employee is. They're more focused on triage and getting people to the hospital. So they're going to give you numbers. Well, 5 were sent to St. Joe's, 6 were sent to Waukesha Memorial. And so then you've got to find out, well, who are those people so you know what's going on with them. So that comes down to the bottom part. So they get transported to the hospital. Well, you as an organization don't have the ability to get information from the hospital on who showed up because we've got HIPAA in place. However, after 9/11, the Red Cross was sanctioned. There was a memorandum of understanding that was put in place that allowed them to obtain a waiver for HIPAA to get information on people that are showing up at the hospitals. So your connection back to getting that name and that information is the Red Cross, because they can go to the hospitals and they can get that and connect the dot for you. So that's a key piece that you want involved and connected to your command center so you can get that information. The other part that's important and I put the dotted line because sometimes we don't think about it, but it's very critical, is those calls that are coming in from family and friends to find out what's happening with their loved ones, and whether that be going to one spot or multiple locations throughout your organization. You've got to have a consistent flow and a consistent flow between the EOC and those facilities, and talking about what's the message that you want sent out to families. When you start to get details about employees, what are those? How are you going to report that back, and keeping that communication channel in place? So that's something that may not necessarily be thought about, but is very critical to make sure you get that information out. So in thinking about that piece of family inquiries, we got to look at, okay, how do you respond to that? Do we have the infrastructure available to do that? If we take, a building of 1,000 employees, that can generate a lot of calls if their loved ones can't get a hold of their family members. You can get hundreds, if not thousands. Well, you got to start to look at, does my telephone infrastructure, is it going to be able to support that? And if it's not going to be able to support that, what other means am I going to put in place to make sure that we can handle those calls? Because again, if they're calling in and they're getting a dead line or they're not getting an answer, they're going to keep trying and trying until they find something out, or they're going to start to show up at the site, which causes problems as well. And so we'll get into, too, some of the things that we've suggested and put in place is some web-based resources. So maybe if it's not just if you can't handle it from a phone system, maybe it's also putting a web-based system in place that helps support those inquiries that may be coming in. The other thing that you have to be prepared for is to explain the process of accounting for employees. So how, it's not like you may have information right then and there, even if you are answering that phone, to say, hey, yes, I know that this person's okay, or I don't know if this person's okay. So you have to be prepared to have information to describe what's happening on that process. That we're getting information from authorities at the scene, from area hospitals in regards to who has been injured, and as soon as we confirm that information, we'll be following back up with you. But you got to give them information to let them know what's happening and what's going on. The other thing, too, depending on the event and the size of the event, it can have significant telecommunication disruption. So that also could be something that could impact their ability to get a hold of their loved one. Cell phone towers can get jammed, and so it may take some time, and their loved one might be okay, but the reason that they can't get a hold of them is because of that. So explaining that piece to the family members who are calling in so they understand, and that continue to try to get a hold of them and keep us apprised if you hear from them or if you don't hear from them, and we'll keep you apprised as we get information. And then providing tools to include family members in the process. Again, when something like that happens, people feel out of control. And so the more you can give them control or something to do, it provides some relief. And so you want to put some systems in place, okay, kind of what we talked about. Well, we want you to continue to try to reach your family member. Here's a number that we'd like you to report back in an hour if you haven't heard from them or if you got an update. Or here's a website that we have in place that you can go to provide an update on as well. So it gives them something to do while they're waiting and you're waiting for information about what's going on with particular people. I put this in here too because it's that same slide that we looked at earlier, but it looks again at that flow of information. And sometimes what some organizations have done to help manage that piece with the family calls and friends calling in is to outsource it. So have an organization like ourselves, or there's other organizations as well, to manage that piece. So then they are managing all those calls, providing the information to families, keeping them apprised, and then that organization is the conduit between you and the families and giving you kind of detailed information about what's coming in, what calls are you getting, what are we hearing. So it kind of depends on what works and what you have available in the resources. But again, the important things to remember is that you want to include family members, no matter what, because they want to be doing something and they're wanting to get information. The more you can include them in the process, the better. Again, what we would suggest is, because there's so many calls coming in, and we can do the educating in relation to what's happening, that we're getting information from the scene, and once we get those details, we'll be following up with those affected loved ones. But as well as we want to hear from you, we want you to keep us apprised of getting in contact with them as well. Because they may hang up the phone and all of a sudden now their loved one calls and say, I'm okay. Or they called out and the phone lines are working now so they can get through. And so a best way is that web tool, and I'll show you what it looks like. And then just giving them that time frame to follow up back on. If you haven't heard from your loved one, we want to hear from you in 3 to 4 hours or in 2 hours. Or if you've heard from them, we want to know right away. This is the website, or the web base that we put together so that people can report in on their loved ones and give updates. It's obviously a secure website. They log in they give a 4-digit code. We always suggest the last 4 digits of your social security number because that's what people remember most, but if they don't want to use that and they want to use a different code, they can. And then your last name, you submit it, and then you put in an update. So when's it the last time since you provided an update? It's been an hour. Who's the person that you're concerned about? Philip Chard, what's the status, not injured, was at the dentist at the time of blast. And so now that information gets pooled together and you can get a quick report on, okay, now we've got some people that are accounted for, and it narrows down your list of people who are missing as well as you're trying to get that information. And last but not least that I'll cover is just employee needs. So we're talking about now the event has occurred and now maybe they're going to be out of work. How do you handle that and how are you going to prepare to answer those questions that are going to come in about, well, am I going to continue to get paid? And is my benefits going to continue to be covered? What about my insurance? You know, if I've got medical injuries, is that coming out of my pocket? Are you paying for that? How do you handle those calls that are going to be potentially coming in? And putting a communication plan ahead of time in place so that you can manage those calls as well. And being prepared to answer those questions, because we know that this is what's going to come out. These are the common themes that we hear in relation to employees. The other part about it too is how does it affect normal operations? Maybe that building can't get back up and running for 3 months, so it's going to go to another location. Well, that may affect schedules and hours and timing, and how are you going to put that messaging out there, and how are you going to connect with people on that, as well as just the communication updates. I mean, if you're ready to open the building, and let's take that there was a workplace shooting, and now people are feeling insecure and not safe. I don't want to go back to work. How are you going to make me feel more secure? What have you put in place to make me feel safe? And so you've got to think about those things and again, put those channels together. What we recommend in this particular area with employees' needs is having a number, an 800 number or something that you set up that either the best is to have answered live to answer those questions. If you can't do that or don't have the infrastructure, then it's having a recording that gives you specific updates and information about each of those items. So it's some things to think about. And then as well as obviously having some on-site meetings where you pull all the employees together to give kind of some broader updates in relation to what's going on with the building, what have you done, what changes have been made, and what's the plan for reopening.